Thank you, Jerry. Thanks for the invite. It's a pleasure to be here. Tonight I'm going to share with you some of the research that my lab has done over the years, as well as providing kind of a broad overview of coral reefs, human impacts, conservation strategies, and current status of these wonderful ecosystems. So I have the pleasure of working in one of the world's most spectacular ecosystems, that being coral reefs. For any of you who have had the pleasure of snorkeling or diving or visiting coral reefs, I'm sure you'll share my enthusiasm for these wonderful systems. They're home to many charismatic mega and microfauna, including these vampire snappers that are very curious about our cameras. But they're just spectacular ecosystems, and they're home to many different species on the planet. And they have a whole variety of really important ecosystem services. From a human perspective, if we want to be anthropomorphic, we can say that coral reefs provide numerous things to human society that we value. One of the things that they're most well known for is their incredible support of biodiversity. So even though if you put all the coral reefs on the planet into one area, they would occupy about the size of the country of France. So less than 0.1% of the Earth's surface is occupied by coral reef ecosystems, yet they're home to over half of the species that exist in the ocean. So these ecosystems are literally living museums that are home to thousands, millions of species of fish, invertebrates, seaweeds, and a whole variety of plankton, and not to mention probably millions of species of microbes that we haven't even yet discovered. So they're incredibly biodiverse, and this is one of the things that they're most known for. Another really important ecosystem service that coral reefs provide is they are the largest living geologic feature on the planet that can be observed from space. So this is a coral reef. It's actually alive. It's growing up towards the sun, and it's building this massive structure, this massive feature, which acts as a source of protection for coastlines around the world, especially obviously in the tropics where they exist. So without these living geologic features, if this reef were to die and to eventually start bioeroding into under the surface, it would no longer be able to protect coastlines from the battering forces of wave energy that are so common along much of these tropical coastlines. So they are important for protecting coastlines from erosion, but also for protection from tsunamis and other more extreme events, hurricane surges and whatnot. So they have this immense kind of geologic importance as a living feature. They're also incredibly important for tourism. So coral reefs generate billions of dollars every year in the form of tourism from people wanting to visit reefs, people wanting to snorkel and scuba dive. So they derive an enormous amount of revenue just for their natural beauty for all of us who are passionate about visiting these reefs and reef ecosystems. And they're also incredibly important from a fisheries perspective. So many developing nations around the world that exist in the tropics derive a large portion of their protein from the reef resources. So these aren't tunas, they're not offshore fish. These are all fish that are collected directly from that coral reef through spearfishing or netting or some other type of fishing activity. And so reefs have this enormous value for humans from a whole variety of different perspectives. And all of these features, all of these services that these ecosystems provide are all attributed to corals, which are this wonderful, amazing animal. Very simple invertebrate. This is a single coral polyp. It resembles a sea anemone. They're very simple organisms. They have a ring of tentacles, a mouth that also serves as their anus, where they excrete. They take in nutrients and excrete nutrients from that same pore. A coral is unique in that one of these polyps will then divide and form what's known as a colony. So all of these polyps are the same genetic entity. They're all connected together through their stomachs, and they share resources. So this polyp could take in a little plankton, and it could, after it gets digested, it could share those resources across the whole colony. So these guys continue to grow and divide and get larger and eventually form some of the largest living organisms on the planet. So this is a single coral individual. It's one colony that's probably over 500 years old. It's the largest coral I've ever seen. This is me actually swimming over it, so you can see from perspective. It was about 25 feet tall and about 35 feet across. And if you were to take a drill and core through the center of this, you would see that it was all one single entity. So over the process of hundreds of years, these corals grow and form these massive organisms.
Where's that at?
This is on an incredibly remote island called Kingman Reef. It's about 20 miles north of Palmyra Atoll, which is about 1,500 miles south of Honolulu in the Central Pacific. It's about as far away from any human population you can get. And so this is really important because as these corals are growing, as these polyps are dividing, underneath this soft tissue, which is literally just like a layer of skin, they lay down calcium carbonate or limestone, that hard rock, which gives these corals this hard texture, right? So if you were to peel off the skin, that living layer of coral that's just on the surface, you would find, in this case, many feet of rock that has been laid down over the 500 years that this guy has been alive. And then, because we have several thousand species of coral on the planet, they take on all of these different shapes and sizes, colors and textures. Every one of these things in this picture is a different species of coral. Some are branching, some are encrusting, some are foliose or leafy, some are knobby, some are plating, some are massive mounding. And this creates this complex ecosystem that we call a coral reef. We consider corals ecosystem engineers because they are literally the building blocks that are alive, that grow and create these cities, these complexity. They're like the redwoods in a redwood forest, only instead of there just being one species of tree, there are thousands of species of corals that create these complex landscapes. So how do corals do that, and how have they evolved in these desert oases of the tropics? So this was a question that Darwin actually was really perplexed by when he visited the tropics after spending days and days out to sea on a ship in just open blue and seeing crystal clear water, and couldn't fathom how much could survive in these really clean, clear waters. And yet he'd stumble upon a coral reef, and he really couldn't understand how these massive ecosystems could thrive in a place that seemed to have no food, no nutrients, nothing in the water, no plankton. It was crystal clear. Well, the answer really comes into coral's secret, which is the magic of symbiosis. So if we take a close look at a coral polyp, we see these little brown specks. And those brown specks are actually the coral's symbiotic algae. So they basically have these little single-celled algae that live within their tissues, and those algae act as a food source. So imagine if you had a garden that lived in your stomach and you never had to eat. It just gave you food every day as it was growing. It translocated proteins and carbohydrates into your stomach. You didn't have to eat. Well, that's essentially what these algae, which are otherwise known as zooxanthellae, the complex term. It's a type of dinoflagellate that live within their gut, and these zooxanthellae give corals up to 90% of their daily metabolic needs. So they still can feed on plankton, but they can receive a large amount of their daily nutrition from these little salad bars that are living in their stomachs. And the zooxanthellae, in return, receive a place to shelter, so they're protected in the coral tissue. Nothing's going to eat them because they're surrounded by the coral tissue. And they also receive fertilizer. So if you think about the coral as an animal, its waste product is nitrogen and phosphorus, ammonia, just like us. And that is what plants need to grow and survive. So the coral gives the zooxanthellae their fertilizer, the zooxanthellae give coral their food, and it's this really tight-knit relationship that needs very little outside energy. So these guys don't need lots of nutrients, they need some plankton, but they don't need the highly productive, nutrient-rich water like we have off of California that drive the productivity of our kelp forests, which is why corals have then thrived in these nutrient-poor seas. So if you look across the tropics, This is where we find coral reefs in those clear, warm waters. That's the only location where you're going to find these reef-building ecosystems. They've evolved under very specific conditions, right? So corals become the ecological dominant in these clear, low-nutrient waters because they can outcompete things like seaweed. Seaweed need a lot more nutrients. They do really well because there's also high aragonite saturation states in the tropics, as Todd mentioned. So this band right across the center of the globe, so warm, clear water, high aragonite saturation state, low in nutrients. So if you look at chlorophyll A concentration, which is basically an indicator of where there are lots of nutrients, you find all the hot spots kind of along the temperate coastlines off of our coast, while the tropics tend to have very low nutrient concentrations or low chlorophyll, which again allows those corals to thrive because they don't need a lot of external sources of nutrients. And then they've also thrived under high rates of herbivory. So because coral reefs support all those different species that I mentioned, there are many species of herbivores. These are species of fish and invertebrates that eat algae. So by having all of these lawnmowers around on the reef, they keep all of the species that compete with coral chopped down, so the corals are able to thrive. And so you can imagine these are all knobs that you can turn on a coral reef, and not every reef has evolved under every one of these specific conditions. You might have some places that have a little bit of variability, but if you alter any one of these to an extreme, or you alter all of them together, you can imagine shifting the balance away from coral domination, right? And so corals have been around for many millions of years. In fact, reef-building corals, the scleractinians, have been around for about 250 million years. So these corals and these reefs have undergone a lot of changes over time, but they've been able to persist. However, in the last several decades, due to a whole variety of human impacts, we've seen evidence of reef decline. And so this is looking at percent coral cover, so the amount of the bottom that is covered in coral estimated by percent, across the Caribbean has massively decreased over the last several decades. So where we used to have up around 50% of the bottom of the reef covered with corals in the Caribbean, now the average is down around 10, and it's remained stable at around 10 for the last, at least the last decade. And this is a Caribbean-wide study, so it's not just one location. Similarly, we've seen evidence of similar patterns across the Pacific. Pacific-wide average of coral cover is about 20%. These data are from about 10 years ago. But if you look at how, we can just look at the top portion of this graph. In the 1980s, we see this histogram is kind of more evenly distributed, which shows that back in this time range, we had some reefs that had 90% cover, 80, 70, 60, 50, 40% coral cover. Shifting into the more recent time period, most of the reefs only have around 20% coral cover. So we're losing those sites that have really, really high coral cover across the Pacific. Similar patterns have been found in the Indian Ocean. And this is kind of what's known as the global coral reef crisis, which I'm sure all of you have heard. Coral reefs are dying, they're going away. We're losing a lot of our coral reefs from a whole variety of reasons. It's estimated that about 20% of the world's coral reefs have already been lost. Many more are in imminent danger. And these losses are occurring as a result of both natural and human-based causes that occur at both local and global scales. And what we see when I say we are losing our reefs, what I mean is we have our wonderful, complex, coral-dominated, reef-building, calcifying, growing system we see here undergo a shift to domination by fleshy algae or seaweeds. In this case, you only see a few little bits of coral sticking out, and this system no longer provides those same ecosystem services that I talked about in the beginning. You lose the complexity, you lose the structure, you lose the reef building capacity of that system. And we've seen these phase shifts occur all over the planet, again, both in the Caribbean and in the Pacific, ultimately leading to what we call the slippery slope to slime. Once you slip into slime domination, it's really hard to transition a coral back a coral reef back into coral domination. And so how do these transitions occur? How do these phase shifts occur? They can really occur based upon two different scenarios. One can be an indirect effect where basically those seaweeds or algae outcompete the coral. There's something that you turned one of the dials that allow those fleshy seaweeds to start outcompeting and overgrowing the coral. Or you can simply just kill the coral and the seaweeds will just grow over that dead coral skeleton. So the first indirect effects typically occur, are impacts that occur at local scales, while these larger direct effects are usually things that are occurring due to global issues. So we'll talk about both of those. The local causes of reef loss that are most prominent are things such as overfishing and nutrient pollution. More locally, you might have sedimentation or things associated with deforestation where you get a lot of mud and dirt running off of land, which can smother reefs. Introduction of exotic species can be a problem, but we'll focus on the first two. These things occurring at a local scale are more like things that would occur in your backyard or in your town or on your island, where managing them at a local level can actually lead to positive change. So there are things that we can do, not necessarily here because we don't live next to a coral reef, but if you lived in Hawaii, you could make a difference by changing something that you do on land that could help improve the health of the reef. So first we'll talk about overfishing, and unfortunately people have gotten really good at extracting fish out of the ocean, especially on coral reefs, and people think it's fun to take trophy fish like this bumphead or humphead Napoleon wrasse, which are the most docile fish on the planet. You can swim right up to them and shoot them in the head and kill them and then take them out of the water and show all your friends that you caught this wonderful, beautiful, old, important fish. Things like parrotfish are also a prized type of fish to eat in the tropics. They apparently taste really good, but are unfortunately really important fish to have on the reef. This shows that group of fish that I mentioned before, the herbivores. These are the lawnmowers, they're the cows, they're the fish that are out there consuming all of the little seaweeds that are competing with coral. So every day, you can see these parrotfish just chopping down that little microforest. If you were to take these fish away, all this little brown fuzz would eventually grow up and start smothering and choking out the corals that are, in this case, competitively dominant. So these herbivores or these lawnmowers are known to be really important. We did a study in an area like on this island where we followed around fish and counted how many bites they took of these algae per minute, and we found that every square centimeter of reef that was occupied by algae was visited by 20 mouths per day. So then you think about taking that away, and these algae can grow really fast. And so the point is these are really important species to have around. So my lab has focused on studying these fish for a long time, or these herbivores, not just fish, but invertebrates. And we do that by putting up cages and removing herbivores from certain areas and looking to see how the algae, can they overgrow and outcompete the coral? What happens when you look at just sea urchins versus fish? I have a variety of students that have focused on the importance of herbivory for maintaining reef health in a variety of different locations, and we've consistently found that when you remove herbivores, the seaweed can overgrow the coral. It's not really rocket science, but it needs to be done, it needs to be shown, and people need to continue to gain respect for the importance of this really key group of species on coral reefs. So this includes things, as you guys go around the aquarium, you will recognize surgeonfish or acanthurids. There are a variety of tanks here that have some beautiful acanthurids. Parrotfish, which have this big beak that can be used to scrape off algae off of the substrate and remove it so that corals again can thrive. And then many different species of sea urchin are also really good lawnmowers. So we consider these guys, again, the lawnmowers of the reef, and if they're removed, you can have problems where they can, the seaweeds can basically start outcompeting the coral. So why am I talking about this? What's the status of these herbivores on reefs? Is there any evidence that they're overfished? Another student of mine did a global assessment of the status of herbivore populations on coral reefs. This just shows the islands that the data set came from. And basically in blue shows the islands that are not fished, and the red shows islands that are fished. And this is just the biomass if you were to weigh all of the herbivores on each one of these islands. And basically you can see there's a lot more big blue bars than there are red bars, aside from a few places. But if you look at the overall mean, there are twice as many herbivores in terms of mass in these places that are not accessible to fishing than in places that are accessible to fishing. And so that suggests that, yes, actually herbivores are being heavily impacted by fishing. And thus this has, we feel, really important implications for the establishment of marine protected areas, because typically marine protected areas have just said, no fishing, no take, we're not allowing any fishing in these areas. We're advocating perhaps we should put more protection on the types of species that we know are really important to maintain reef health, and that would be these herbivores. So we were fortunate enough to be part of the establishment of the first herbivore fisheries management area, which went into place on the island of Maui. This was back in 2009. It's several kilometers of coastline, and this whole area allows fishing of other species, but it provides protection for all of the species of herbivores. And the herbivore protection area went into place on this reef because that reef was actually suffering from seaweeds overgrowing the corals. And in the past, so now it's been 8 years since the protected area has been in place, and we've seen the reef start shifting back. And it's amazing because I've worked there since I was a graduate student, and you never saw schools of these herbivores. You'd see one or two here and there, and now you can go. If any of you go to Maui, this is a really popular snorkeling and diving location. It's off of Kaanapali Beach Park. The beach park is called Kahekili, and now you can see schools of herbivores swimming around, and you can watch them eating, and you can see the reef actually, coral cover has actually started to increase. So we're advocating for more of these herbivore protection areas. It seems like a no-brainer now that given the state of coral reefs, the one thing we can do is at least protect the lawnmowers that we know if they're gone, the corals are going to be getting stressed from those competitive seaweeds. So now we'll look at the other aspect, the other dial that you can turn, and that is land-based pollution. So we add a variety of different sources of pollution into coral reefs, whether it be fertilizer from agriculture. This is right above Honolulu Bay on the island of Maui, where there's a lot of pineapple farms. You might have fertilizer going onto golf courses. You might have raw sewage or some variation of various treated sewage types, or you might just have runoff from land coming from upland communities. And all of these things can basically add nitrogen and phosphorus into the ocean. So we already talked about coral reefs being clear, the water's crystal clear, it has very low nutrients, and when I say nutrients, again, I mean nitrogen and phosphorus, which if you're a gardener, you know that that's fertilizer for your plants. That term is called oligotrophic. Oligotrophic means low nutrients. So when you add nutrients, you add fertilizer to a reef, well, guess what? The same thing that happens in your garden happens on the coral reef. You can fertilize these weeds. Anytime you see a bloom of seaweed like this on a coral reef, I can guarantee you that there's a nutrient problem, and you can use your ecological detective work to go back and find the sewage pipe or find the drainage ditch that's leaking some sort of fertilizer into the water. So there's been numerous studies, again, looking at how if you add fertilizer, you add nitrogen and phosphorus onto a coral reef, you can get the stimulation of these seaweed blooms or algal blooms. And this is, again, not necessarily rocket science. If you have an oligotrophic system and you add nutrients, it's not surprising that you could shift the balance. But it is still a big issue, and one of the projects that I worked on as a student, again, was on the island of Maui, where we noticed that there were 3 massive seaweed blooms happening on this island, and lo and behold, those 3 massive seaweed blooms were all directly downstream of the 3 sewage treatment plants. Interesting. Well, how do they treat their sewage? They basically inject millions of gallons of secondarily treated sewage into the ground in these large injection wells. So they're basically wells that are 100 feet deep, drilled into the ground, and they're not capped with cement. They're just a hole dug in the ground. Well, if you think about Hawaiian Islands, they're volcanic. The island is built out of basalt. You put liquid in a hole, it goes away. Where do you think it goes? So after years and years of doing research trying to pinpoint where these algal blooms were coming from and where the source of the nutrients was coming from, of course, everybody on the island is like, oh, it's the ag, oh, it's the pig farmers, oh, it's the sewage treatment plant, and nobody wanted to take blame. Of course, there are many overlapping types of land use on these islands. We finally got permission to put a fluorescent dye into the injection wells up in Lahaina to see if we could watch it coming out on the reef that we knew these algal blooms were occurring on. So you can kind of see, it's much easier to see at night, but you can see a tint of green coming out of this water, and this is green, the green dye coming out on that reef. This is only about 5 feet of water. There you could see the green better. If you go at night with a UV light, you can really see it fluorescing. So yes, there's sewage coming out of this reef, and there are a lot of people snorkeling and freediving and scuba diving and kids playing and wallowing around, and this is one of the most popular dive sites on the island. So this eventually led to a bunch of nonprofits, a bunch of environmental nonprofits suing the city and county of Maui in violation of the Clean Water Act. A whole variety of scientific studies went into basically into the testimony for this lawsuit. I was one of the expert witnesses, and just about a year and a half ago, or yeah, just about a year ago, we finally settled with the city and county, and they basically finally agreed to do something about it. But it has been many, many years of painstaking fight and battle. Of course, the city just doesn't want to deal with it because it's going to cost a lot of money for them to rebuild their sewage infrastructure. But ultimately, if you think about an island like Maui, where they're already pumping the water table, essentially saline because there's so many people there, and they're just letting all the sewage and wastewater go away where they could be recycling it and at least using it for agriculture or for all the golf courses that are being watered on the island. Or they could do something smart like many states in the country now, which is just completely cleaning the water and reusing it for drinking water. But of course, that all costs money, and it all sounds great, but it's much harder to implement when you actually put the rubber to the road. But at least this is moving in the right direction. This just gives you an example of, you know, sometimes some of the difficulty in trying to actually solve some of these problems. So ultimately, we do need to hold those agencies and municipalities accountable for ensuring that we have clean water, both drinking water as well as ocean water, because swimming in sewage is, I would argue, not a healthy thing for us or our children. And of course, scientists like myself can help to identify those sources and the potential impacts. But ultimately, we need to do a better job of making sure we're managing that wastewater and reusing it. In this day and age, it seems completely wasteful that we're not. And ultimately, it should pay itself back financially. So it's thinking about long-term investments a little bit more intelligently. There's all kinds of things. I mean, why would we be throwing nutrients away? We need nutrients to fertilize crops. We need them to potentially even grow biofuel, which could be a booming industry in the Hawaiian Islands if they actually were working on that. So, okay, we've talked about the two big local impacts that affect coral reefs. One being overfishing, especially of those herbivores, and the second being the addition of nutrients. And now we're going to switch over and talk about some of the global impacts. So these are things that can actually directly cause coral mortality. Things like global warming and sustained high temperatures across the tropics, as well as ocean acidification. And the increase in the intensity and frequency of storms can also be a big one, but I'm not going to focus on that today. So we'll first start with ocean acidification. And Todd already gave you guys a primer on what ocean acidification is, so I don't have to talk about the chemistry, which is great, because I'm a biologist. Todd's the chemist. I'll field all the difficult questions to him. But basically what we know is that there's more CO2. As CO2 gets emitted into the atmosphere, it dissolves in the ocean, it changes the chemistry, And the important point for a coral's perspective is the amount of carbonate, which goes into calcium carbonate, which is their skeleton, becomes less available. And so it can become more difficult for things like corals to build their shells and skeletons under ocean acidification conditions. Todd showed you this, so we know CO2 is increasing in the atmosphere, it's also increasing in the ocean, and that results in a concaminant decrease in pH, which is shown in green. These data are taken from the open ocean. So these are from the Hawaii Ocean Time Series, which is off of Station Aloha, which is out in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. I forget how many miles off of the coast of Oahu in deep water from the surface. So this tells us what's happening when we take the pulse of the open ocean, but it doesn't tell us what happens in the nearshore coastal environment. So we need to know what the natural variability in pH or carbonate chemistry is on a reef, not just out in the open ocean, because where you have a thriving ecosystem like a coral reef, or even here like a kelp forest, all of those organisms can be changing pH because they breathe and they inhale and they exhale, and that changes carbon dioxide concentration. So we need to have better data from these other more shallow ecosystems. So Todd showed this figure from one of the first publications that we did, really comparing what coastal pH looks like. So again, there's our open ocean, and it's pretty much a flat line. So if you want to measure if ocean acidification is happening in the open ocean, you just have to see if the slope of that line is changing, which is much easier to do when you have a stable or relatively stable environment like that. Imagine going to an upwelling system or a kelp forest where every day the pH could be swinging 0.4 units, which 0.4 units is greater than what pH is expected to drop by in another 100 years. So if every day you're seeing a shift in 0.4 units, how are you going to be able to detect a change in ocean acidification over time? Well, you need a lot of data, and these are only 30-day windows of data from a whole variety of different ecosystems. You certainly can't draw a line through that and try to claim that you're seeing ocean acidification, right? So we definitely need a lot of data. This was one of the first data sets that we had to be able to compare different systems, and you definitely see interesting patterns, again, with coral reefs showing a really interesting diurnal pattern that we'll talk more about. And then some of these systems like kelp forests and upwelling systems, well, these are driven by big coastal processes where you get cold, nutrient-rich, low pH water getting pushed up onto the shelf associated with ocean currents. And then these daily blips that you have, that's the biology on top of the oceanography. So they're complex patterns that are happening. So that really led us to start what's called the SOAR program, or the Scripps Ocean Acidification Research Program, where we're focused on measuring pH in these coastal ecosystems. So working with Todd and his wonderful sensors, we have a long-term monitoring program for pH off the Scripps Pier, as well as on a remote coral reef as far away from human populations as you can get, so that we can measure pH on a reef in the absence of all the other confounding things that might be happening on a reef. And then in addition to knowing what pH is doing, we need to measure how marine organisms are responding to OA. So this just shows our pier data off the Scripps Pier to get some local context, and this is from 2013 until the beginning of this year. The black line's temperature, the red lines are pH. And this just gives you a feeling for how variable this is, right? We actually have, this is one of the longest time series data that's nearly continuous that exists, as far as I know, for California. And you know, there's a lot of daily variability. And so in terms of, if anyone asks me, is ocean acidification happening in California, do we see a trend, or at least off of the Scripps Pier, I would say we don't have enough data to say, even though we have 4 or 5 years of almost continuous data, because you have to be able to pick up a signal through all of this daily noise that we have, and through the upwelling signals and everything else. And so I would say it's complicated, right? It's a lot more complicated than if you just looked at the open ocean. Similarly, If we go as far away from human populations as we can get and go to the island of Palmyra in the center of the Central Pacific, this is an island that is under U.S. jurisdiction. We occupied it during World War II and has since been turned into a Nature Conservancy field station. It's a wonderful place to study coral reefs and climate change because there's no fishing, there's no pollution, and it's as kind of pristine as you can get. And there we put out, again, a whole bunch of TOD sensors across a whole variety of habitats. And we've been measuring pH on the reefs of Palmyra also for about 4 or 5 years. And this just shows a recent snapshot of data from the last year from one of our sites. And again, there's a lot of daily variability, right? You get, in this case, it's more like a 0.2 swing in pH every day. You see this up, down, up, down, up, down, and then you see some of these, trends that are coupled in some cases with changes in temperature, which could be oceanographic events that are causing kind of these more sinusoidal patterns over the time course of a year. But the really interesting thing, I think, that a lot of people hadn't necessarily realized, or a lot of people are regularly surprised by, is on a coral reef you get this really characteristic daily up-down. So who knows what that is? And so carbon dioxide uptake during the day by plants, and then at night everything is releasing CO2. So anything that's photosynthetic, which includes corals because they have their zooxanthellae, and any seaweed takes up CO2 all day long, and that raises the pH. And then at night everything is respiring, releasing CO2, and that drops the pH. And so you can literally watch the reef breathing throughout the day. And sometimes, like if you look at the blue lines, you get higher peaks on some days than others. And this could be a rainy day, and this could be a sunny day. So you can actually see how the weather and the conditions affect the daily patterns in pH on these reefs. So these measurements that we have now for coral reefs have only recently been available thanks to Todd's dedication and work on building these autonomous sensors that we can now leave in the field for a year and basically come back and hopefully have data, although it's usually a bit of a gamble. But we see substantial daily variability, right? So that variability, if the average pH is around 8.0 for the ocean, and pH might be expected to decrease to 7.8 as soon as 2100, we're seeing those excursions happening every day. So pH is dropping to 7.8 in some cases every day on these reefs, which doesn't mean that ocean acidification isn't going to be a problem. It just means that, well, reefs and reef organisms are already seeing 7.8 right now, so they might be potentially adapted to it, and or the big question is the mean going to start changing? So you still have this daily variability, but over time, the mean is still decreasing. So that's meaning that now instead of 7.8, it's 7.7 and then 7.6. These are all questions that we don't know the answers to, which again highlights the complexity of this ocean acidification issue, especially when you think about these shallow coastal systems that are well lit, that have high productivity, photosynthesis and respiration happening. We also see really clear habitat differences. So the top graph is a shallow reef terrace, something like this, where it's only a few feet deep, it's really bright, it gets tons of light. And then this bottom one is a deeper fore reef that's about 30 feet deep, that's really well swept. There's a lot of currents and water motion. And so of course the shallow reef has much bigger daily variability because it's like a swimming pool. It's like a big aquarium. And so the organisms in this swimming pool are changing the chemistry, and they can change the chemistry in a way that you can measure it much easier than if you're out on a deeper fore reef where they're still changing the chemistry, but the water's getting swept away, things are getting dissolved and flushed, and so you don't see as big of a daily signal. But you do see more of these oceanographic events. So these are things like upwelling events that would be causing these big excursions. So we see differences in habitat, and then we also see those diurnal or daily variability, daily swings. So the gray bars are nighttime, the white bars are daytime. And so you can very clearly see that this is associated with daylight and photosynthesis and respiration. So this just summarizes what we've learned basically during the day. Everything that photosynthesizes is taking up CO2. They produce oxygen as a product of photosynthesis, and that the uptake of CO2 raises the pH. And then at night, everything is respiring. Nothing is releasing oxygen. Everything's consuming oxygen and releasing CO2, and that reduces the pH. So knowing this, we now know that, well, we know that organisms can change the chemistry around them. And so this can be used potentially to our benefit, or it also opens up a lot of extra questions. So in a place where you have a lot of photosynthesis, will that ecosystem actually be able to buffer itself against OA? If they can take up as much CO2 as is going in, they might be able to potentially, buffer the chemistry around them. So these are all outstanding questions that we're actively interested in addressing. Ultimately, in order to answer the question, is ocean acidification happening in these systems, we need to continue to monitor, and that's why new innovations in monitoring technology that Todd's lab is doing is really helping us biologists kind of understand what's going on in the coastal oceans. Next, we need to understand how marine organisms are responding to this change in chemistry. And the standard way to do this is to take your favorite pet organism, whether it be a mussel or a clam or a coral or a seaweed, and stick it in a jar and bubble CO2 into those jars. Pretty basic, but we like to do experiments and tinker with our favorite organisms. The problem with these experiments generally in the past has been that we look at the projections and we say, okay, so pH is supposed to be 7.8 in the year 2100. So I'm going to make all my containers 7.8, and the other half of them are all going to be 8.0, and I'm going to see if the corals live or die. Well, if you just paid attention to what I just told you, that corals on a daily cycle experience this huge variation. If I just hold them at 7.8, they've never seen that before, and so they're probably not going to be very happy. In fact, most experiments that have focused on OA have been these static reductions in pH without allowing that natural variability to happen. So even though I'm going to summarize what we know about the effects of OA on organisms, marine organisms, keep in mind that most of these have been these static reduction in pH experiments. They haven't been experiments that have allowed the natural variability to occur, but then just reduce the mean. So you have maybe your control that's up here and then your OA treatment that's down here. That would be a more reasonable experiment. Of course, those are harder to design because you have to add variability into an experiment where you're trying to control things, and it just gets complicated. Anyways, so the summary is that everything in red has had negative effects associated with ocean acidification. Everything in green has had positive effects. So we'll see negative effects occurring on calcifying algae. So there are certain types of seaweeds that also have calcium carbonate in their tissue. They've been negatively affected. Corals have shown negative responses. Coccolithophores, mollusks, so oysters and mussels, have shown negative effects. Varying effects on echinoderms like sea urchins and sea stars. And then no significant effects for a lot of crustaceans and fish. And then we see the green down here, positive effects on fleshy seaweeds. So why would that happen? So for a photosynthetic organism that doesn't have a shell or a skeleton, you add CO2, you're basically just giving them potentially more resources for photosynthesis, right? And so if carbon dioxide might be limiting to these guys for some reason, you add CO2 and they might actually be able to increase their growth rates, which has, again, important implications for thinking about, might we be able to use biology to help us manage at least some coastal systems like aquaculture to OA. So just this summarizes it a little bit more easily. So we've seen positive responses for fleshy algae and diatoms, negative responses for many calcifying things, including algae, a lot of bivalves, where we've seen a reduction in survival as well as a reduction in calcification. So just because we have negative effects doesn't mean that these treatments have been killing these organisms. You might just see a reduction in growth, or you might see thinner shells or more brittle skeletons. So we've seen negative effects on these guys. More recent publications have been showing that ocean acidification can have strange and unpredictable effects on some fish, where in certain experiments, fish have lost their ability to sense predators under ocean acidification conditions. So something in their neurological sensing systems have been altered to a point where they now start swimming towards their predator, which obviously wouldn't be a good thing. But again, this is an emerging field, and one where I would argue a lot of the experiments haven't been done in the perfect design, which we're now all working towards trying to figure out how to include variability in our experiments. So ultimately, a lot of us are concerned that on a coral reef, where the entire ecosystem is built out of calcium carbonate, we might see a shift away from these reef-building environments, or dominance by reef-building organisms, to dominance by these fleshy seaweeds or bioerodiers, which would have obviously big implications for the persistence of those ecosystems and their ability to provide those ecosystem services that we care about. There's been a lot of buzz in the world about, well, how might we be able to use certain organisms like seaweeds? We know that if you add CO2, they actually might increase their growth rate, but they also act as CO2 filters. They take up CO2 and turn it into biomass. So might we be able to use seaweeds to buffer our shellfish farms against ocean acidification? Whether or not we can scale this up at an appropriate level to make it relevant is still, as of yet, undetermined, but I always envision you could have sensors in your aquaculture facilities alerting you when pH is getting to a certain low level that might result in mortality or a loss of your crop, and you could go deploy a curtain of seaweed around your oyster farm and have them kind of shelter, buffer the system, which sounds ridiculous, but I mean, if you think about the cost associated with the loss of entire crop of shellfish, it might actually be a reasonable thing to think about. For the tropics, there are seaweed farms that already exist all over for the carrageenan industry. Carrageenan is a cell wall polysaccharide that's used in almost everything that we use. And these seaweed farms are occurring all over. And so we kind of have a natural experiment that's out there waiting for someone to figure out whether these seaweed farms are changing carbonate chemistry in a way that might facilitate calcium carbonate precipitation, even if we use these seaweed farms as like coral nurseries or something like that. But surprisingly, we don't know really anything about what the chemistry looks like in these farms as of yet. So these are all things we can work towards thinking about more locally. There are a lot of you guys interested in aquaculture and shellfish aquaculture. I would argue that in any case, having polyculture where you include seaweeds would certainly only benefit the system, because they're going to be changing chemistry in a way that could facilitate calcification, but they also can be helping chemistry potentially from reaching those extreme lows that might actually cause a negative effect on your growth. Plus, people want to eat seaweeds because it's the new superfood, it's the new kale on the market, and there's a lot of demand for seaweed in Southern California, so something to think about, something that I'm really excited about. I think that I'm running low on time, so I'm just going to briefly go through global warming and effects on coral reefs, which is obviously a big one. We know the oceans are warming. Todd already talked about that. We know that the oceans are warming significantly. This is since 1901. Everywhere where there's an orange or a red is an area that has increased in temperature by up to 2, 3, 4 degrees since 1901. Why does that matter for coral reefs? Well, when coral reefs undergo warming conditions, they experience something known as bleaching. Bleaching prevalence has increased massively in the last couple of decades. And so what is bleaching? Bleaching is basically where, when corals experience warm water for an extended period of time, they release their zooxanthellae, their little algal symbionts, out of their tissue, and they turn white because the zooxanthellae are what give them their pigments. So they release their food source into the water, and if they have to remain without that food source for an extended period of time, eventually they're going to die, and you're going to get seaweeds growing on top of the skeletons, and you'll end up in this kind of scenario. However, corals can recover from bleaching if they're not experiencing warming for weeks and weeks and weeks on end, or if the temperature isn't really, really, really hot. So there's, differing degrees of bleaching and the ability of a coral to go either to full mortality or to go back to recovery. They can miraculously regain their symbionts from the water. It's still a mystery that we don't really know how it happens, but they can somehow find zooxanthellae in the water and filter them out and stick them back in their tissue, which is one of those amazing mysteries that we don't totally understand. Why does bleaching happen? Why would they get rid of their symbionts? Well, basically, when it gets warm, the symbionts start producing a toxin. This is the short summary of this. And the corals can't deal with that. In fact, they can start actually being damaged. It can cause damage to lipids, proteins, and even DNA. And so they have to get rid of the symbionts to prevent them from basically poisoning them from the inside out. We've seen a lot of evidence of bleaching in the past, especially the past few years, where we've seen a healthy reef go from high pigmentation seen here in December to a fully bleached reef a few months later, and then to a completely dead reef a few months later. This is Australia, the Great Barrier Reef. And so we've seen this happening over and over again. If we take a brief look at the history of bleaching, it's crazy. The first bleaching event that was ever recorded in scientific history was in the late 80s. And then in 1998, we had the first global bleaching event where we had bleaching happening at many different locations around the world. Then in 2010, we had the second global bleaching event. And then in 2015, we had the third global bleaching event. So if you look at the timeline of these, we're basically cutting the time in half. And so now we've been in this 2015 global bleaching event still into 2007. So it's lasted for 3 years. Not everywhere, and it's definitely, there is evidence that it's tapering off and that there aren't many places right now that are currently bleaching, but it's been a long, long road. This just shows bleaching of like what thermal anomalies looked like in 1998, and then in 2009, and this shows what this most recent bleaching event looked like. So we've really increased the magnitude and extent, the geographic extent, as well as the intensity of the heat that's occurred. This shows the prevalence of bleaching reports from the first 1980s, 90s, 2000, 2005, 2010. So you can see each year it's not focused, it moves around, and that's because not everywhere in the ocean warms equally, so you get hot spots. But then in this 2015 to 17 event, we really had reports coming in from all over the world. So pretty much everywhere that had a coral reef had bleaching reports. Specifically interesting, the Hawaiian Islands never had bleaching, ever. It had never been reported in history. And in 2014, 15, 16, they got hit for 2.5 years consecutively. So definitely the largest, the longest, and the most geographically widespread phenomenon that we have seen. It made a lot of media reports, specifically all over the world, whether you be in Hawaii or in the Great Barrier Reef. There were reports and newspaper articles declaring the Great Barrier Reef extinct and dead, that it was, undergoing this massive loss, which is definitely true. It varied depending on what part of the GBR you were in. So the northern part had really high bleaching and mortality, but the southern part didn't experience so much. So even though this is a global bleaching event and there was widespread death and mortality, it doesn't mean that every coral reef on the planet is dead. I'd like to just make sure we all have that clear. In fact, data from our own long-term monitoring on Palmyra Atoll showed that it actually is really interesting Not all locations are affected equally, and not all coral species are affected equally. So this is a case where this coral bleached and it died. So this is about 6 months apart. This coral bleached and it was able to fully regain its zooxanthellae and looks completely healthy 6 months later. This coral was bleached and it also was able to regain its zooxanthellae. So this is thinking about you can get hit by a disturbance or a stress event, but you can come back without dying. This is another really interesting one where this big plating acropora had massive sections that were bleached but healthy tips, and a lot of this white area died. You can see this kind of fuzzy brown area here, but the coral was already regrowing back over its skeleton. So this is a case where, because corals are clones, they're colonies, half the coral can die and then it can just regrow back over its skeleton. It can have remnant tissue that can act as sources to repopulate that skeleton that it had already formed. That's the beauty of being a colony, right? They're so modular. It's like you can take a little vegetative propagated piece of plant and stick it in the ground and it'll grow. Well, corals are so much like that. And so this is a case of where in 6 months, even though there was mortality, it was already regrowing back over its tissue. So this provides us some hope for the future, a little bit of a positive message that not all reefs around the world died. There are unique ways why not all corals would respond to bleaching similarly, because there are different species of zooxanthellae that live in their tissue that have different susceptibilities to thermal events. So that's one reason why you get these partial bleaching where the top is not bleached, the sides are bleached. You might have a different type of zooxanthellae here that's not tolerant to temperature, but these guys are. And so they can kind of switch around their zooxanthellae communities depending on the conditions that they've experienced. Other studies have found that corals can actually weather a bleaching storm by eating more, which isn't rocket science either. Remember, they can still eat plankton. So if you've gotten rid of your salad bar and you're not getting that food that you're used to getting every day, well, if there's a bunch of plankton around, you can kind of squeak along by feeding on plankton. And so this provides some hope for thinking about places that might have more oceanic productivity. Those reefs might be able to persist during periods of warming better than others, just through the process of eating. So thinking about what factors contribute to coral mortality following a warming event, well, obviously the location. So if you're in the middle of a hot spot, you're probably going to bleach. And if you're in the hot spot for a really long time and temperature is really, really hot, you might die. But if you're out on the edge, you might be able to bleach and recover. But of course, we also think exposure to previous warm water events. So if you've gone through a bleaching event and you survived, you might be more resistant or tolerant to future bleaching events. And that's something that we're really interested in looking at. But also local conditions. So if you have a bleaching event and you're dumping a bunch of sewage on your reef, do you think those corals are going to have any chance of coming back? You're basically just like giving the seaweeds a chance to start growing and overgrowing the skeletons before the corals even have a chance to try to recover from a bleaching event. I always liken this to the healthier individual you are. If you're really, really healthy, you can get a disease or a microbe, a bacterial infection, but you're going to come back and be healthy again. If you don't take care of yourself and if you pollute and you take out all the fish and you treat the system like crap and then you give it a bleaching event, it's going to be like, barely scraping to hold on. So local management can actually increase the resilience of coral reefs to things like bleaching events. And we've seen this across the remote Central Pacific. You go to islands that don't have any people, that have never had human populations, and even though there's been global bleaching events, they still look like this. You think about a place like the Republic of Palau that has the most progressive marine management and conservation strategies in the world, thanks to President Ramenggasau. The reefs there are still thriving, and they take marine conservation very seriously. They have 80% of their EEZ protected, and if you fish there, this is what's going to happen to your boat. Seriously. They burn boats to the water. They take the people off first, but the reefs of Palau, we were just there a few months ago, and this is what they look like, even though they had some bleaching happen during this last event. So by managing things locally and keeping water quality clean, we can continue to have reefs that look like this into the future. So these remote reefs provide an important baseline and remind us that if you take people out of the equation, at least at a local level, the corals can still do all right. They've been around for 250 million years, right? So managing at the local level can help mitigate global impacts. And so if we want to continue to have these ecosystem services into the future and maintain having coral reefs, we obviously need to manage carbon emissions. Of course, we've got a little bit of an uphill battle with that with our current president, but many of us are still on the ground fighting. But we know in the meantime, we can manage things locally to make those reefs as healthy as they possibly can. And I just end by talking for 1 second about a project that we have now at Scripps called the 100 Island Challenge, where we're trying to understand what makes one reef more healthy or more resilient, more able to withstand a bleaching event and survive than others by studying 100 islands around the world that span gradients of human population as well as natural oceanographic conditions. And partnering with local resource managers, we're using our data to help ensure that better management strategies are put into place. This shows the span of the islands that we work, and the novel strategy that we're using with this work is we're using novel 3D imaging. So this allows us to take pictures of coral reefs using these digital SLRs. We take thousands of pictures. Basically, it looks like we're mowing the lawn. So we back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, taking thousands of pictures. And then when we get back to the lab, we can stitch all of those pictures together using a program called Agisoft, which builds this photo mosaic. So these are 10 by 10 meter sections of reef, which is about the size of this room, that we can bring back home with us, and we can then study like we have the reef in our backyard or on our computer or in our house. So now we spend the time taking images when we're in the field, but then we come home and we extract all the data from our computers. And we now, for every island out of the 100 islands that we go to, we have 8 study locations per island. And then every one of those we're going to go to over time so we can watch growth and death and mortality, response to bleaching, and how different types of local management activities help to either increase growth rates or maybe cause higher mortality. We have a lot of these models on our website if you guys would like to look at more of them. This shows a time series, so we can actually literally stitch these photomosaics on top of one another over 2014, 15, and 16 to watch corals grow and die and actually disappear and fuse into one another. And it gives us just the ability to study reefs in a way that we've never been able to do, because normally we've only been able to collect these data when we're physically underwater measuring things and counting things and trying to, get as much as you can while you're on a scuba dive. Well, now we can spend hours and hours doing this when we get back to the computer. We can digitize every species into a different color. We can look at how they're spatially arranged. Do some species like to be next to each other? Do some species avoid each other? Do some species facilitate one another? And you'd never know this at this scale because your eyes can't even see that when you're in the field at this scale. So now we can do this from home, from 100 islands, and how they grow, how they die, how they recruit, how they interact. And so it's been a really awesome experience, and it's something that everywhere we've gone, we work with local partners, but one of our local partners told us that, I'm a fisherman, and the fish, they have a voice. I can see what they're doing when I catch them or when I don't catch them, but we don't ever see the reef. These images, they give the reef a voice, and so that was really powerful. So we want to share these images with everybody, and they're really powerful education tools because you can take kids on a virtual dive. We're starting to do some with VR and some 3D goggles, but in the meantime, we have a lot of this information on our website, and I have some cards that has that on it with me if you would like more information. Obviously, tons of people have contributed to all of the work that I've talked about today, but I know I'm out of time, so stop.